Alright guys, welcome to the final part of this little game asset series where you learn the basics of what you need to create your very own assets. So obviously we've already done all the main stuff: modeling, triangulation, unwrapping, low poly, high poly, stuff like that. The final thing we need to do is get the high poly ready for export and then bake out our normal maps onto the low poly from the high poly. So the general guideline whenever you're exporting the low and high poly is they both need to be triangulated if you're doing the workflow presented. So we also need to triangulate the high poly version, which can be a bit more tedious and a bit more difficult, but it's really not too bad. So we're just going to start one by one. We're going to start with the base here, and we're going to do it exactly like we did the low poly in the last video. We're basically just going to do that little star connect trick, but this time we have a bit more vertices to deal with. So we're going to do star connect, and I need to, like I said, this is a mesh machine trick. There's probably an add-on somewhere that allows you to do the same thing. I'm just not familiar with it, and you can always join them manually, but we're going to do the same exact thing here. Just going to hit it with a star connect just to make the video a bit quicker so I'm not wasting time. And then what I want to do is run a knife cut here. So K, click, C, Z, and then we'll run a knife cut like that all the way through. And now we're going to have another connection point for this area. There we go. And then we're going to do the same thing for this one. Star connect, and now we can dissolve out these areas right here with Control X. So perfect. We are missing this side. We'll do this piece and then the piece below it, and then we'll basically be able to just symmetrize the entire thing and we'll be good to go. So the easiest way to do this is to add a mirror modifier. We'll do X and Y, bisect, and all that good stuff, and we're going to have the same effect on all the sides here. Alright, perfect. So like we did in the last video on the low poly, we also need to kind of set up the top, because right now the triangulations on the top are going to probably cause some pinching in the corners here like that, and I'm not a fan of that. So I'm going to press the F key and we're just going to do what we did before. Just join these up. You can press Shift R so you don't have to keep pressing the J key, and now we're going to have that, and then we're also going to have the bottom here. Going to need to join up these areas, so just like we did on the top, we'll do Shift R, and then make sure you select the right ones, and one more here. Alright, perfect. So now we have a triangulation on that area, and everything looks fine. I don't think there's any issues with this one. We could dissolve out these two edges right here. We don't need those. And let's just do Control T, see if there's any weird triangulations going on. I don't think there are. Everything looks okay to me. So at this point, instead of doing the triangulations destructively, I'm just going to use a triangulate modifier. We'll put that triangulate modifier above the bevel here, and you're going to see looks just fine. Alright, so that piece is done. Really easy. We're going to do the same thing for this one, but this time we have to triangulate these holes up here. Now, this is why, I'm going to show you right here, this is why I never really recommend the auto triangulations. This is why I do triangulations manually in Blender. You're going to see sometimes these automatic triangulations will cause these artifacts. So if I were to just export this without triangulating, this artifact actually wouldn't display properly in the software. So if I put this in Marmoset or Unreal, whatever, and it did the triangulations behind the scenes automatically, and cause these artifacts, it wouldn't be able to render these artifacts. It would actually just kind of collapse the mesh and it would look awful. So this is precisely why we always triangulate inside of Blender beforehand. So one trick that we discovered, Ryu and I, before we made the game asset course, is we can actually make these triangulations on holes work properly simply by running an offset on this set of edges here. Now you can either use Mesh Machine to run the offset, so there's an offset feature for that, but I'm going to do this the vanilla way because, like I said, I want to do an entire vanilla workflow. So what you can do is simply duplicate this outer set, and then of vertices, that is, scale it up, And then what we're going to do is P to separate by selection. And now we're going to have these two pieces. So we can basically run a knife project here. So I'm going to select this area. We're going to shift click on this area, tab into edit mode. And if we select everything and go into top view, I can go to mesh and then knife project. And what that's going to do is it's going to project a knife cut into this area. And you're going to see we actually have some overlaps here. Let me merge by distance, or sorry, just delete out the original one that we separated. And now we're going to have just the area on the mesh here. So now if I try to run a triangulation, you're going to see these triangulations actually work. And I don't really think I've ran into a situation where this type of trick doesn't work, because it always fixes the artifacts, because no longer is it running into a bevel, it's running into actual geo on a flat plane. So these artifacts can't actually occur. Like right here, even though these are running really tight, there's no way it can have an artifact because there's no bevel on this area causing an overlap. So that's the general way I do those types of triangulations. Now, I don't want to do the full triangulation yet because we still have to fix up some areas. So let's see. Like we did in the last video, what I think I'm going to do is dissolve out that piece right there. And let's just connect this one up. Something like that will be okay. And keep in mind, we're not worried about the topology on the high poly because we're not going to be using this for anything other than baking. So even if the topology looks nasty, this is literally meant to be a baking piece. It's not going to be in the game engine at all. This is only for baking. So I kind of, you can get more sloppy with the topology on these types of pieces. On the low poly, I would obviously be a bit more careful. So we have this, and I'm going to J key to join that. And what else do we have to do? This bottom area might be a bit tricky as well, so we might need to run a knife project on this bottom area as well. So what I'm going to do is same thing as before. Shift D to duplicate, scale it up. We're going to press the P key to separate by selection, and then same thing, select this, shift click this, and we're going to go into the bottom view by pressing Control 7 on the numpad. And then if I go into edit mode and select everything, we can do a knife project on this area and then simply delete out this piece right here. So we have that. We also have a functioning area down here as well, which is awesome. And as for the top, I think that's about it. I'm not worried about the poly count on the top. I'm not worried about anything other than a proper triangulation. So we have that now. So what I'm going to do is simply run a mirror modifier to get the same effect on all the other areas, these four corners, right? And if I go into wireframe, you'll kind of see, I should have showed this before, but as we add this mirror modifier and bisect it and flip it, we're going to have the same effect on all the sides here, which is exactly what we want. All right, so let's apply the mirror modifier, add a triangulate modifier, and then we're going to move the triangulate modifier to the top here. And you're going to see we have no issues at all. If you go into wireframe, you can kind of preview. Looks kind of ugly, but like I said, this is only for baking, so as long as it works, it works. And you're going to see we don't have any sort of artifacts anywhere, so whatever engine you export this into is going to be able to read it perfectly, which is exactly what we want. And the final thing we need to do is triangulate these bolts right here. Now these are mostly quad and tri base, so I should just be able to hit it with a Control T and not have any issues at all. It might cause a little bit of distortions around this area, but it's such a small piece, I don't care. As long as there's no artifacts, then we're good to go. So we have that, and what I would recommend doing at this point is joining everything together. So by the way, when you export, all the modifiers will be applied on export, so we don't really need to apply the triangulate or the bevel modifiers. It's not really necessary. But we do need to join everything together, so I'm going to select this and then shift click this and Control J, and you're going to see it looks like this one actually, the bevel picked up and was a bit too big. So instead of actually running a, notice how the bevel picked up, instead of having this occur, what we could do is set the limit method here for the bevel over to weight instead, and manually select the edges we want to mark with a bevel weight. So what I want to do is tab into edge mode here And I'm just going to Alt-Shift-click this area. And we're going to mark these edges with a bevel weight. So that way only these edges that are marked are going to be the ones getting beveled. Now the bottom we don't have to select because there's no face down there, but we will select this one. We'll just Alt-Shift-click all the way around. We're going to do that and select this area. Like that. And then just same for these. There we go. And then what we're going to do is go to the end panel under Item and increase the mean bevel weight to a value of 1. So we have that. And then we'll go right here. We're going to do the same exact thing. So we're going to set this to weight and simply Alt-Shift-click the areas here that we want to have beveled. So it's mainly going to be these sharp edges. You could use the Select Sharp Edges feature. Actually, I'm going to do that right now. Select Sharp Edges, and then we're going to go to Mean Bevel Weight, drag that to 1. And we're going to have a bevel there. And then finally, we don't want to have any bevels on this area. So what I'm going to do is we'll set, well, as a matter of fact, what we can do is join all these together now with Control J. And for these bolts, we just press the L key and remove the bevel weight on the bolts. So that way the bolts don't actually get beveled at all. We don't really need that. Or if you wanted to, you could make the mean bevel weight for the bolts like really, really tiny, but I'm just not going to bother. I'm going to keep it at 0. So now what we have is the high poly mesh joined together, and we're ready to export. So what I like to do before I export is I like to go to the low poly, and in the low poly, I usually make, first of all, make the low poly named base_low, and make sure these names here are identical. You can simply drag and drop to do that. And for the high poly one, we're going to call this base_high. You can name it whatever you want. Just make sure you do the _low and _high so it'll bake properly. It's important, and Marmoset reads it based off of those key tags or whatever it's called. Yeah, we're going to do the same thing for the high poly and just drag and drop so we have the same name there. So now what we have is the low poly and the high poly. So for the high poly, I'm going to export this. File, Export, FBX. Base_high, selected objects ticked on. And then for the low poly, we're going to do the same thing. As a matter of fact, you can export this into one single FBX file if you wanted to. You can just select both. It doesn't really matter. I guess just to make it clean, I can do separate, but I'm 99% sure you can do it in one FBX file. So you can do whatever you want. I'm going to call this base_low. Now we can go into Marmoset here, and Marmoset is really simple to use. What we're going to do is go to this little bread icon. We're going to click on that, and we're going to click on the quick loader and load in the high poly. Going to do that, and you're going to see we have a high poly here, and we're going to also load in the low poly. And let's load that in. And what I need to do is scroll out. For some reason, I'm like really zoomed in. I think it's one of my settings. Anyways, there we go. So now what we need to do is check for any distortions. We need to make sure it's rendering properly. So the low poly is just fine. The bottom's weird because we don't have faces on the bottom, which is fine. We're not going to see the bottom. So that one rendered properly. Now we need to check the high poly, and we can do that by clicking on this bake project, clicking on the L to turn off the L, and clicking on the H to turn on the H. And you're going to see the high poly is displaying perfectly as well. The bolts look fine, and we're ready to bake. So baking is pretty easy in Marmoset. I'm going to turn the low poly back on. And what I want to do is change the sample count to something high like 16. We'll do 16 bits a channel, and we'll do like a 4K bake. We'll just click the up arrow like that. And to preview the bake, we click on the P for the preview. And we have to make a new output path, so I'll click yes, and I'll just make a new folder here and just name it whatever you want. Fasta, I guess. You can name it whatever you want. We're going to wait a second for it to preview. And now you're going to see it's baked basically perfectly. Now these bolts do look a bit fake. We can fix that, but pretty much everything else is pretty good. You might get some weird distortions around the corners here, and that is most likely a result of this really shallow baking area. You could do that by, or fix it by simply removing that on both pieces, so that way it's just one empty space on the entire thing. The thing with baking is rarely perfect. You can get close to perfect, but go into any video game model, really zoom into bakes, and you're going to see oftentimes the bakes are just okay. Because trying to get a perfect bake is going to waste a lot of time. I'd always recommend going for as good of a bake as you can, but be realistic with it. Bakes are not perfect, it's fake. So we have this, and we basically have the effect that we want. And now what we need to do is click on this low poly, this low option right here, and we can make this look a bit more realistic, these bolts right here, by going to paint skew. And if you go to paint skew, what we can actually do, we'll move this out of the way. If you paint the areas where you have bakes, it's going to actually make this look a bit more three-dimensional. And I'd usually recommend doing this. You can hold Alt and right mouse button to move around, and then Alt and middle mouse to just keep switching positions. We're just going to paint this area here, and we're going to paint this area here as well. Just makes it look a bit more kind of leveled. And what I'm going to do is go back to this bake project to see how it looks, and looks just fine to me. We can also fix some of these baking artifacts right here by going to the low again and painting the offset. This will basically adjust the cage, which is how far the baking vectors are going into the mesh. So if I just kind of smooth out this area, in this case it did a pretty bad job, but if I just carefully paint, you could use a tablet if you wanted to. You can hold Control to paint out and just click to paint in. And what we're going to do is just kind of paint out those nasty artifacts that we see without disturbing the other areas too much. And this is just a very, very simple, yet you need to be very, pedantic about it. And just be careful, because you want these bakes to look good, but you don't want to have to spend too much time. Let's see how that looks. Much better. We do have a few baking artifacts down here we could take care of. So I'm not going to worry about the whole entire thing. It's not that big of a deal, but I do want to fix these corners up a bit if I can, because the corners look kind of bad. You can see as I paint that, the more that baking issue kind of goes away. But that's up to you if you want to do the entire thing. I'm just going to work on the corner. So just paint this area. Try our best to kind of get these little pieces here and there. And it's not going to be perfect, but it is going to be a lot better than you had before. And now as you can see, that corner looks really clean. We also have like a slight baking artifact here. And these are the types of things that you can worry about if you want to, but oftentimes probably not necessary. So that's how you would do that. Unfortunately, there's not a mirror offset option that I know of, so I'm pretty sure you'd have to go to each of these corners manually to fix that, and I'll allow you to do that on your own accord because I just want to save some time here. But yeah, you basically just go around, you can paint the offset, you can fix the skews, and you can make these bakes look as good as you want, basically. And this is why I use Marmoset, because Blender does not have such robust tools. It just doesn't. So this piece is basically done. We have these bolts, we have the bakes, and it looks really good. So the high poly has 14,000 tries and the low poly has 1,000 or 2,000, but we saved a lot of geometry there, and you can imagine a much bigger object. This is going to really make it more optimized, which is exactly what we want. So yeah, that's basically all you need to do in Marmoset, and you're going to see it looks pretty similar to the high poly with these bakes, which is exactly why we did it. So at this point, we need to actually do the real bake. This is a preview, so to do the real bake, we just click on the bake button right here. You can bake things like ambient occlusion as well. You can make a curvature map, material ID if you wanted to. I'm just going to do ambient occlusion, curvature, and normals, and we're going to click on the bake option right here and just give it a second to bake. Oh, by the way, what I would recommend doing is baking this as a JPEG or PNG or something, because by default it actually exports as a PSD, a Photoshop file. And we can do that by going to this button right here under output, and I'm going to delete these. I don't want these. I want to export this as a PNG instead. So we're going to do that, and we'll just name this maps or whatever. And let's bake it again, and we'll click on that and bake. Now to access your maps, you go to the folder you made when you click the preview, and you'll be able to open them in here. So here's the normal, here is the curvature, and here is the ambient occlusion. And this is exactly what we want to use whenever we're doing texturing or bringing this into a game engine. So at this point, what you would do is you would bring this into Substance Painter or Quixel to texture it. I won't be doing this in this tutorial series. There's plenty of Substance Painter tutorials and texturing tutorials out there to watch. So basically, if you wanted to do that on your own, you would bring that FBX file into you know what, I'll show you. I won't do the texturing, but I'll show you kind of the workflow. Let me open up Substance and give you the rundown. Okay, so if you were to go into Substance, you would just go to File, New. You could just make this like a 4K resolution. You're going to select the low poly FBX file. And then what you would do is you'd basically add in those maps that you just exported, or made a marmoset, whatever. So we'd select all of them, we'd click on open, and that's it. And then what would happen is you'd see this in Substance Painter, and to actually apply those maps, you would go over to your texture set settings, select that normal map, that's going to load in, and then you would select your ambient occlusion map, and then you would also select your curvature map to kind of get nice texturing effects around edges and such. And that's how you would get ready to texture that in Substance. You could drop a material on here. We'll just drop a rusty one because why not? And yeah, you can do the texturing on your own, but I'm not going to do it in this tutorial. But let's pretend you just finished texturing it. What you would do is you would import into Unreal Engine your low poly. We'll just import everything. And we're just going to drag this into the scene. And you're going to see it displays just fine here in Unreal Engine. And at this point, you would basically just connect up all the maps from your texturing software into your material here, which once again, it's really easy to do. You just plug and play to base color, metallic, roughness. Not too complicated. You can just look it up on the internet if you need to. And that's the general workflow for a game asset from Blender to Marmoset to Substance if you want to texture it, and to Unreal Engine. It's not very complicated once you get the hang of it, but it is a bit tricky at first. So I hope this tutorial series helped you out. I really wanted to kind of get the general workflow down in one series. Now, if this series did help and you want to learn more, something more in-depth where you actually texture it and go through the entire process, I would recommend getting our game asset course. We made this a few months ago. A lot of people loved it. And if you haven't picked it up, I'd really recommend you do that. It's going to have a lot more in-depth stuff compared to what this series had. But I just wanted to do something free for YouTube to kind of get more people into that area. So that's about it. Link to that course will be in the description. If you want to join our Patreon as well, we do monthly tutorials in Blender if you want to see those. And that's about it from me. Thanks a bunch for watching. See you in the next video.